Good evening, everyone. I'm Ed Remus, the Social Sciences Librarian here at Northeastern Illinois University's Ronald Williams Library. On behalf of the university and of the library, welcome to tonight's discussion. This is the fourth panel event we've organized as part of our ongoing Between Past and Future event series, a series co-sponsored by the library and the history department here at NEIU. Between Past and Future events feature informed speakers with differing perspectives on controversial topics at the intersection of history and politics. Past panels have explored the topics of reparations for Black Americans, the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and the legacy of the October Revolution 100 years on. We've been fortunate to work with CAN TV in recording many of these events and making them available to a wider audience at home and online, and we're grateful to have CAN TV here again with us tonight. The topic of tonight's discussion is political realignment. In organizing tonight's event around this concept, we mean to raise a number of broad questions. Is the balance of power changing between and within the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States? If so, how significant are these changes when viewed in light of history? And why are these changes happening now? The concept of realignment is also sometimes used to refer to changes that are more global rather than national in scope, and more socially total or world historical rather than narrowly political in character, such as the change between welfare statism and neoliberalism, or between the modernist project and postmodernity. We're fortunate to have panelists with us here tonight who can address the question of realignment on both of these levels, national and global, and talk about how they're related. We're even more fortunate to have panelists who can address questions of history and politics from genuinely distinct intellectual perspectives. Now, in promoting this event, we build our panelists as Dan McCarthy, the conservative, Deirdre McCloskey, the libertarian, Ellie Shermer, the progressive, and Marco Torres, the socialist. But the meaning of each of these four terms, conservative, libertarian, progressive, and socialist, has been the subject of considerable scholarly and political debate for a very long time, and some would no doubt challenge our speakers' claims to represent these ideas, and perhaps they themselves would take issue with this characterization. But what I can say is that each of our panelists identifies, I think, strongly with at least some aspect of one of these perspectives, and will hold up their distinct perspective in a way that will set them apart from every other panelist. And it's my hope that this differentiation will enable our audience to view the past, the present, and the future through each of our panelists' eyes. To my left is Ellie Shermer. Ellie will talk about how the realignments growing out of the 1912, 1938, 1964, and 1972 elections in the United States have set up the potential for a 2018 realignment. Ellie is an associate professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, where she teaches and researches the history of American political, economic, urban, and policy changes since the Civil War. She has written scholarly articles, literature reviews, and the book Sunbelt Capitalism. Her published work includes 2 edited collections and opinion pieces in the Washington Post and Bloomberg. She is currently finishing a book on the history of student lending entitled Indentured Students. To Ellie's left, Dan McCarthy will talk about the American rights, internal realignments from the 1970s to the present, and will consider whether the lack of an intelligentsia will cause Trumpism's downfall and the GOP's revision to 1990s Republican orthodoxy. Dan is the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies and the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. He is a regular contributor to The Spectator, US, and served as editor of The American Conservative from 2010 to 2016. He has also worked in publishing as a senior editor at ISI Books and in politics as the official blogger of the 2008 Ron Paul presidential campaign. He's a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, where he studies classics. Deirdre McCloskey, to Dan's left, will argue that the 2 big mistakes that the party system has perpetrated recently worldwide and in the US are a tip to fascism and a tip to socialism, and that we do better with moderate establishment politicians making deals in smoke-filled rooms. Deirdre is a well-known economist and historian and rhetorician who has written 18 books and several hundred scholarly pieces on topics ranging from technical economics and statistics to the ethics of the bourgeois virtues. Her latest book, Bourgeois Equality: How Ideas, Not Capital or Institutions, Enrich the World, published in 2016 by the University of Chicago Press, is the third in a trilogy. It identifies the egalitarian liberalism of Voltaire and Smith and Mill as the cause of the explosion of commercially tested betterment after 1800 and the cultural enrichment of the world. A new book, How to Be a Humane Libertarian, Essays in a New Liberalism, will be published by Yale in 2019. And finally, to Deirdre's left, Marco Torres will argue that the heightened alarmism about fascism and populism since the 2016 election and the Brexit vote expresses a growing fear of mass democratic politics among political elites as a result of the decline of neoliberal politics. Marco is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago and a transient lecturer in numerous campuses across the city. His article, titled "The Landslide in Mexico," in the September issue of the Platypus Review, interprets the Mexican general election of 2018 in relation to the global decline of neoliberal politics. Marco is currently working on a doctoral dissertation titled "The Popular Picture, Modern Art and Mass Politics in Mexico and the United States, 1919 to 1939. So I've asked each of our panelists to present for about 12 to 15 minutes. And after this round of opening presentations, we'll have a response round during which I'll invite each panelist to indicate both a point of convergence and a point of divergence with each of their fellow panelists. I'll then pose a question to kick off our discussion, and I'll moderate audience Q&A until perhaps 9:30 if we can make it that long. And at this point, I'll invite each of our panelists to give a very brief closing statement to address the long arc of the conversation. So we'll reserve applause for the end of the event, but not before giving a warm welcome to each of our panelists.
So first and foremost, I want to thank Edward Remus for inviting me back to NEIU. I'm honored to be here tonight in the company of these esteemed panelists, and of course y'all on a Thursday night before Labor Day, when there's apparently a jazz festival in town. So Edward posed some provocative questions to this panel, and I'm going to answer them as a historian who described herself as a social democrat or democratic socialist before the word progressive became cool again, and so many people felt the burn in 2016. 2018 could very well be the death knell of a political realignment that started more than a century ago, which has crippled the US government in all three branches and at all three levels since the 1970s and contributed to this country's current status as a declining superpower. A symptom of that larger quagmire has been the decline in voter participation and citizen engagement since Watergate. But the fierce fights in both parties during the primaries, as well as the uptick in Americans willing to run for elected office, take active participation in politics, and generally engage in this nation's civic health, indicates that 2018 might be the beginning of a genuine expansion of social democracy in this country. However, the efforts to redraw electoral maps, restrict voting, and pump corporate money into politics to stop this popular uprising might very well lead this country further away, both from its social democratic promise and its founding principles. Now, American politics realigned dramatically over the course of the 20th century, and although as a historian I really don't like picking any one election cycle or year, there have been four: 1912, 1938, 1964, and 1972, that together highlight how the 2018 midterms might be more than a century in the making. Now, 1912 was a four-way race between socialist Eugene Debs, Republican William Howard Taft, Southern Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and bull moose progressive Theodore Roosevelt, the former Republican president. These men exemplified how the parties would realign themselves in subsequent decades and elections. Homegrown Midwestern radical Debs stood for that faction of the American left, which would never make peace with the most left-leaning members of the Democratic Party and would continue to fight for social democracy outside of its confines, even during the mid-20th century Red Scares. Taft represented the long-standing Republican allegiance to big business and minimal regulation. He largely trusted the courts to finish what historians label the corporate reconstruction of America that began in the 19th century and set up the 20th century's political, economic, and social twists and turns. Now, Wilson personified the many Southern Democrats who struggled to make peace with or take advantage of that corporate agenda, but also could not stomach many progressives' desire to rebalance American federalism to give more power to the federal government. That's, of course, what Teddy wanted, as he made clear in his very famous 1910 speech calling for a new nationalism, which inspired many Americans, but failed to give him the GOP's nomination in 1912, an indicator of how the GOP would begin to come apart at the seams in subsequent decades. No one could ignore that coming tectonic shift by the 30s, when Teddy's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presided over a New Deal which socialist Norman Thomas damned as stealing his party's agenda. That's not true. New Dealers in both parties wanted to save, not abolish, capitalism. But their most lasting achievements toward those ends and moving more power into the national government came after historic presidential and midterm victories in 32, 34, and 36. I told y'all I don't like to pick one date, right? Anyway, in those years, the Republican Party actually included some liberals, like a young Nelson Rockefeller, who refused to switch from his family's party, the GOP, as FDR had. Rockefeller worried that would pull the Democrats further to the right. Instead, he stayed in the GOP to try and pull it further to the middle. The Democrats, in contrast, included a motley crew of those on the left, liberal Democrats, and Southern and Western Democrats. Now, those retrograde Southern and Western Democrats had enough seats in Congress to have what historians have called a veto on the most far-reaching legislation, even after the 34 and 36 elections gave liberal Democrats a large number of seats. But those Southern and rural Western Democrats always had the power to water down New Deal legislation and preclude women and minorities from getting a New Deal, particularly after the 38 midterms, a stunning rebuke of Roosevelt's infamous court-packing plan, the president's efforts to dethrone Southern demagogues, and the policies that led to the so-called Roosevelt recession. 38, then, was a pivotal year in 20th century Americans' political realignment and what's on the table in 2018, because Southern Democrats and right-wing Republicans started to find common cause to thwart liberal Republicans and Democrats' ambitions and sustain the efforts to persecute the American left, which actually existed long before Republican Senator Joan McCarthy made headlines by waving that famous list of subversives in 1950. But McCarthy was just one of the men and women critical to the creation of a conservative movement, arguably one of the most powerful political movements of the 20th century, that upended the GOP and further transformed 20th century American politics. The movement brought together Americans in both parties opposed to liberal, foreign, economic, and social policies. Now, modern American conservatives' growing appeal, strength, and reach can best be seen in '64. Another pivotal year in understanding this country's political history and what's at stake in 2018. In '64, liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller, I didn't just mention him in the beginning to be cute, battled conservative Republican Barry Goldwater for the GOP's nomination, and as many said at the time, the very soul of the party. Today, in 2018, experts are hard-pressed to name a single liberal or even moderate Republican. Many pundits have forgotten that war within the GOP and overlooked Goldwater's opposition to LBJ, the last New Dealer to reside in the White House. Talk about an end of an era. That status many have forgotten, even though the Texan cut his political teeth in the 1930s. And Roosevelt famously said when he met it, that young man might be the first Southern president in many generations. I messed up the quote a little bit there. Up until recently, historians regarded his '64 win as one of the most sweeping victories in American politics. Not anymore. Scholars now consider it the battle that Republicans lost so that conservative Republicans could win the almost 50-year war against the New Deal in 1980, when Goldwater protege Ronald Reagan triumphed. The 40% of Americans that Goldwater won over across the country in '64 served at the GOP's base for decades. But as with 1912 and 1938, '64's consequences are only clear in retrospect. Leading political scientists have shown that Southern states didn't become solidly Republican states until almost 20 years later. That's important to remember, because many experts still wrongly repeat LBJ's famous line when he signed the '64 Civil Rights Act: "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." It looked that way in November '64 when 5 of the 6 states that Goldwater won were in the Deep South, and South Carolinian Strom Thurmond dramatically switched parties. But LBJ actually knew better than that. since the Texan had almost lost his Senate seat in 1960 to Republican John Tower, whose politics were identical to Arizona's Barry Goldwater and far more complex than that statement actually says. It wasn't just about race. Those stances helped Tower win the subsequent special election for LBG's Senate seat when he assumed the vice presidency. Now, Tower's political career highlights how slow, complex, and multifaceted this country's 20th century political realignment was, and why '72 was such a pivotal year in American politics. It wasn't so much Nixon's reelection, but the building Watergate controversy, which historians have noted seemed to inaugurate a dramatic collapse in Americans' trust in government, willingness to join political parties, turnout on election days, and overall civic engagement. That was a recipe for more than 40 years of political malaise, to use a word that Jimmy Carter actually never used in his famous speech. Since the 60s, government bureaucracies and courts govern this country more and more, which only feeds citizen apathy and frustration. Voters have also been increasingly turned off by the increasing antagonism between Congress, the courts, and the presidency, which has increasingly resulted in government shutdowns as well as legislative action through budget reconciliation, which still might not survive judicial scrutiny. Disagreements between local, state, and federal officials have also frustrated Americans because laws, policies, and procedures have become increasingly unclear and changed quite rapidly. Americans also increasingly dislike the two major parties, which have been increasingly more ideological coherent since the 70s. Indeed, the number of Americans willing to register for either party has dramatically fallen since the 1970s. Now, none of those trends have helped the United States weather the dramatic political and economic shifts around the world since the 70s, when the Arab oil embargo foreshadowed how former European colonies would bring Western democracies to their knees by harnessing the resources and technologies provided to them during the Cold War. American executives in the so-called knowledge economies may still sit atop this new world order and have the money to pump up the cost of elections, but many Americans have been left behind at home in this new multipolar post-industrial world order. And that reality only feeds Americans' political apathy and frustration. Discontent across the political spectrum has fueled both third-party movements and insurgencies within the two parties in recent decades. Democrats, for example, still blame Ralph Nader and the Green Party for Al Gore's 2000 loss. And many of the centrist Democrats in the Clinton camp also hold a grudge against left-wing insurgents like Howard Dean, Dennis Kucinich, and of course, Bernie Sanders, who exemplified how the American left still struggles more than a century since the 1912 election over the question of whether they belong inside or outside the party. Republicans have also found themselves bedeviled by those inside and outside their party. Right-wing populists have frustrated conservatives, including Goldwater, since the 50s. Initially, those Americans in far right-wing groups, like the John Birch Society, provided conservatives with much-needed votes. Yet the militant far right also alarmed those Americans whom the Republican Party wanted to court. But extremists soon found even conservative Republicans like Goldwater too tame, especially after they became the GOP's new establishment after '64. Their frustrations fueled nationwide excitement for George Wallace's forgotten '68 independent run. That Alabamans showing across the country, not just in the South, provoked the last serious bipartisan attempt to rid this country of the Electoral College. Now, right-wing populists have steadily gained footing in the GOP at the local and state level since the 70s, but were not taken seriously in their independent runs for the presidency, including Ross Perot's startling 1992 bid. Now, look, he didn't win a single Electoral College vote, but he still won almost 20% of the popular vote and energized some right-wing populists to challenge conservative Republicans from outside and within the GOP. The most famous example now is, of course, Donald Trump. But notice I didn't name 2016 as one of those pivotal years in American politics and political realignment. That outcome was also more than a century in the making, as will be the 2018 results. The midterms are nevertheless shaping up to be truly pivotal, since there is voter interest and civic participation across the political spectrum, and that's something to celebrate that historians have not seen since Watergate. And the sheer range of Americans willing to run for office, learn about current events, and participate in civic life actually shows encouraging signs for a more small d democratic America. It may even be more socially democratic, since the electorate has been trending liberal, even progressive in recent years. Now, that's only obvious in the popular vote, since 40 years of party infighting, gerrymandering, and voter suppression have not guaranteed those folks the representatives whom they want. Folks, the 1965 Voting Rights Act is in tatters. And that's a warning that in 2018, when the country, to borrow from Michael Harrington, is once again vigorously left, right, and center, it could easily become either more authoritarian or more socially democratic. Thank you all.
Well, although I might disagree with some of the intellectual infrastructure of Professor Shermer's remarks, I think actually the storyline she's laid out is a very good parallel for the remarks I'm about to deliver. The pattern is, I think, quite clear to scholars and also to people who are engaged as writers, as thinkers, as policymakers, journalists, and activists. There's starting to be, I think, perhaps a convergence of these very different sorts of fields and these very different ways of approaching American politics, and I think the pattern is becoming very difficult to deny. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of the Republican Party and the conservative movement today, and why, as Professor Shermer had indicated, there are in fact certain parallels that can be detected 30 or 40 years earlier. Right now, you may see in the mainstream media a great deal of shock and consternation, a belief that the Republican Party has undergone a sea change in the last few years. Indicative of that is perhaps the reputation of John McCain right now. Of course, a decade ago, John McCain was the Republican Party's nominee for president. But shortly before John McCain's death in the past week or so, recent polling from Fox News found that a majority of self-identified conservatives had a disapproving view of John McCain. And a rather large majority of self-identified ideological liberals, about 64%, had a favorable view of John McCain. So that suggests perhaps there has been some sort of realignment, some sort of shift in the two parties and in not just the parties but also the ideological blocs that are aligned with them. Now, I think in some cases, in some respects, the McCain phenomenon is a little bit misleading because you may recall, of course, in 2008, the McCain campaign was so worried about its right flank, so worried that it would not be able to energize conservative right-wing voters, that it put Sarah Palin on the ticket as his vice presidential running mate. Similarly, if you actually look at John McCain's earlier 2000 presidential campaign, it's notable that most of McCain's appeal, or at least a large part of it, a critical part of it, in the Republican primaries that year, came from open primaries. It came from people who were not already self-identified as conservatives or as Republicans, who were able to vote in places like Michigan, for example, and boost John McCain's appeal. And it seems to me actually one reason why George W. Bush becomes the nominee is that the right, which already had reservations enough about George W. based on what they viewed as a kind of lackluster record as governor of Texas, and also based on certain reservations about the Bush family in general and its commitment to the sort of conservative agenda. Nevertheless, conservative activists in 2000 wound up seeing George W. Bush as a kind of savior, not only coming at the end of the Clinton era. They not only saw George W. Bush as someone who could perhaps beat Al Gore, but they also saw him as an alternative to a more left-wing or more progressive Republican Party under John McCain. Now, whether that perception is accurate or not is something I think perhaps people should look quite critically at. I think both in terms of how progressive John McCain was, there's room for doubt, and also in terms of how conservative George W. Bush was, there's room for doubt. My own perspective is that there's very little difference, and was at the time and is even now, between McCain republicanism and Bush republicanism. And certainly if you look at voting records and other things, it becomes quite clear that McCain was not that much of a maverick during the George W. Bush years, far from it. He was actually, of course, one of the outstanding supporters of George W. Bush's signature foreign policy moves, especially the Iraq War. Now, he did, of course, make some criticisms of waterboarding and other forms of torture, but McCain didn't actually go very far in terms of introducing legislation that would try to stop these practices under George W. Bush. But in any case, I want to get back to the idea that there are precedents for a populist realignment in the Republican Party. And if John McCain is kind of an indication that a certain form of elite opinion, both among some Republicans, but even more so among the mainstream media, has one understanding of what the Republican Party is, whereas the grassroots, the people who have this negative view of John McCain, reflect a very different sort of intellectual tradition and a very different opinion. This is not a totally new phenomenon that you have this divide. And Donald Trump is, in fact, sort of the culmination of quite a long line of Republican grassroots right-wing insurgencies against one form or another of the Republican establishment. What's surprising is that the Republican establishment undergoes a series of changes over time. So let's look back, and I think Professor Shermer was very helpful in pointing us to 1972 and also bringing up 64 and 68. Because you see a tremendous change taking place in the Republican Party, very much comparable to what you see right now, underway very much in the 1970s, but with certain precursors and foreshadowings in the late 1960s. Basically, I came to town yesterday, to Chicago, to take part in a panel on the Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal debates, which took place in conjunction with the Republican and Democratic nominating conventions in 1968. So first they provided commentary, color commentary, on the Republican convention in Miami, which nominated Richard Nixon. And then subsequently, basically 50 years ago this week, they did color commentary on the Democratic convention in Chicago, which of course ended with a riot, basically, with the police being very aggressive towards protesters. Tear gas was flowing into the convention hall itself. And you had this quite dramatic contretemps, somewhat more intellectualized than what was happening on the streets, but still quite sort of bloody in its own intellectual way, between Vidal and Buckley. But one of the things I thought was interesting in preparing for this event I did yesterday, I read over the transcripts of the interviews, the debates between Buckley and Vidal in the Republican convention of that year in 1968, the convention that nominated Richard Nixon. And what stands out, first of all, is that Vidal and Buckley agreed that the foreign policy plank in the 68 Republican platform was one that a hawk or a dove could have run on. And Richard Nixon himself was trying to be very ambiguous at that point as to where he actually stood on the Vietnam War, which was by far the hottest issue of the day at that point. The Democrats, of course, were torn between quite explicit hawkish and dovish wings, between Lyndon Johnson, who had decided not to run for re-election, and the other hawks in the party who wanted to see someone Johnson-like sort of pick up his banner, and then the side of Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, which was seen as being the dovish and anti-Vietnam War faction. The Republicans, on the other hand, were trying to be quite moderate and ambiguous, at least going into the convention. But the other thing that was very remarkable about that year's Republican convention was how few of the hot-button issues we now identify as being sort of clear earmarks separating the left and the right, conservatives and progressives, Republicans and Democrats, were actually salient in 1968. So there was no discussion of guns, no discussion of gay rights or religious liberty, no discussion of abortion. Roe v. Wade, of course, had not happened yet. Even in terms of economic policy, while it was clear that the Republicans had a more pro-business, a slightly more smaller government perspective, you didn't have a discussion of tax rates, a discussion, of course, of supply-side economics, which was another idea that would not come into fashion for another decade or so. That basically you had, a state of American politics in 1968 where there was a conservative movement. The Republican Party was identified as being the more conservative party, and yet so much of what conservatism and even republicanism came to mean in the generation after that had not yet fully formed. And that kind of reinforces something which I had already known, which is that the key decade for the conservatism that we have known between the Reagan era and the end of the George W. Bush era, but the key decade in forming what became the conservative orthodoxy at that point was the 1970s. It's in the 1970s that you see a proliferation of single-issue groups. It's in the 1970s that, gun issues, a tax revolt led by Howard K. Jarvis in California. It's in the 1970s that, of course, abortion after Roe v. Wade starts to become a key issue. It's in the 1970s that you see the formation, taking in a couple of different issues, but actually in large part opposition to the so-called Equal Rights Amendment. You see the formation of an organized Christian conservative grassroots movement. So the Moral Majority officially forms in 1979, but it has a few precursors in the years leading up to that. And this it calls itself actually the New Right at the time. And it has a markedly more populist attitude than the conservatism that came before it, for the most part. As Professor Shermer mentioned, you actually do see some premonitions of this, both in the John Birch Society and in parts of the Goldwater movement. But in general, the Republican establishment was shocked by the emergence of this new sort of culturally aggressive, populist new right. And it's interesting to look at some of the politicians that this new right mobilizes to elect. So obviously Ronald Reagan becomes, the great standard bearer. He's the one that everyone can name. But one of the first great successes of the populist new right in 1976 is electing Orrin Hatch. Now, Orrin Hatch, if you're coming from the left or the Democratic Party, may seem as conservative as any Republican. But basically, to Trump supporters and to the Republican right today, Orrin Hatch is seen as about as squishy as a John McCain, if not more so. So it's interesting to think that Orrin Hatch was seen as being a kind of, not exactly a radical right-winger, but certainly someone on the right of his party in 1976, and today is seen as being a mushy moderate of the sort that a lot of populist Republicans would like to get rid of. You also see in 1980 a number of great lions of liberalism, especially post-Watergate liberalism, go down to defeat in their Senate campaigns. So Senator Frank Church is defeated in 1980, and so is Senator George McGovern. And the new right takes credit for that. It claims that it organized populists in Middle America to reject, these incumbent Democrats who were seen as being sort of too liberal for their districts and too liberal for their states. George McGovern, as you know, of course, comes from South Dakota, and that's, a state that now is seen as being reliably Republican and rock-ribbedly so. So you had this populist insurgency in the Republican Party on the right and among conservatives in the late 1970s. It really shakes up the party quite dramatically. And Ronald Reagan, who had been seen as, on the right of his party in 1968 when he runs as one of the alternatives to Nixon, by 1980, he gets the nomination, he becomes president. And really you see much different and in some ways more aggressive forms of conservatism that are more populist start to emerge in the Reagan era. And it's interesting to look at Barry Goldwater's reputation as you go into the 1980s and 1990s. Once Goldwater dies, there is a kind of rehabilitation. But in the late years of Goldwater's life, Goldwater is sparring constantly with Christian conservatives and is someone whose views on abortion and homosexual rights and other things are viewed with great suspicion by the conservative grassroots. So again, you've seen waves of populism come into the Republican Party in various other occasions. What's interesting, what's different perhaps now about the new nationalist populism that you see with Donald Trump is that it's not aligned with a particular intellectual readjustment in American politics as well. So in the 1970s, and Ellie had mentioned 1972 as being critical, one of the things that happens as a result of 1972 is that a number of basically Lyndon Johnson-style Democrats, or people who would have been on the right wing of the Democratic Party, on the intellectual right, too, of the Democratic Party, are shocked and horrified by George McGovern and by the new left of the early 1970s, by the rise of more critical views towards Israel, for example, of the rise of greater enthusiasm for third world revolutionary movements among some Democratic candidates in the 1970s. So as a result, moderate and conservative Democrats start to move away from the Democratic Party after 1972. And many of them become what we now know as neoconservatives. And they move into the Republican Party at the same time that you have this populist upswing in the Republican Party. And at first, there's a great deal of some animosity, but also just some misunderstanding and alienation between the neoconservatives on the one hand and the populist new right of the 1970s on the other. But over time, and especially during the Reagan administration, these two elements amalgamate. And so I think the Republican orthodoxy you get in the 1990s, which combines, a Christian conservatism with also a kind of pro-business, free market economic side of things, and a very hawkish but liberal democratic hawkishness, I should say. It's exporting democracy. It's the George W. Bush so-called freedom agenda. This foreign policy is basically something that is designed by neoconservatives and that they are able to promote because they have the electoral muscle of the populist new right behind them. So you get this alliance. And some of the intellectuals on the populist new right actually don't like this alliance. They splinter off and they become so-called paleo-conservatives in the 1990s. And we can get into the details of that in the Q&A. But what you see happening now with the Trump realignment, whether it's because, on the one hand, sort of grassroots populist conservatives feel betrayed and alienated by people like Orrin Hatch and the Bushes, for example, or whether it's simply because the issue environment now is so different from the one that had prevailed over the last 30 years. So right now, the thing that it seems animates a lot of grassroots conservatives the most is not, for example, gay marriage, which was a big issue for them during the Bush years, but rather are things like immigration and also trade policy, and the idea that we should have a more nationalist sort of America First trade policy. And the kind of nationalism in foreign policy that the Republican Party championed in the Bush years, which was a kind of internationalist nationalism, an idea of exporting democracy and American values, is now also very much out of fashion with the grassroots American right. And you see that Donald Trump was very critical of the Iraq War and of the Bush family during the 2016 campaign. But right now, even though you have this populist change in the Republican Party and among conservatives, you don't have something similar to the neoconservative movement. You don't have an intelligentsia which is moving from the left into the right. And you'd actually seen more than once the American right take a great deal of energy from having a left-wing or formerly left-wing intelligentsia move into its direction. So you saw that with the neoconservatives fusing with the populists in the 1970s. But you also saw it a generation earlier when a great many ex-communists, people like James Burnham, for example, and Whittaker Chambers, became the backbone of National Review, and they became the backbone of the kind of conservatism that Bill Buckley was trying to design. And it's interesting because at first, Buckley's conservatism in the 1950s actually does not have a great deal of electoral muscle. And it's a very awkward fit at first between the Buckleyites and the Goldwater campaign. The Goldwater campaign has a great many John Birch Society members, for example, participating in it. And a number of people within the Goldwater campaign think that National Review is not really populist enough, not really conservative enough in the right ways. And on the other hand, they also see the National Review as being, sort of too conservative in other ways, perhaps, sort of too hard line on certain foreign policy issues, even though Goldwater himself could also be quite a hardliner. So you have an awkward marriage between an intelligentsia and a populist movement in the Goldwater era. Then you have a second one come about during the 1970s, which leads to Reagan and then ultimately to the sort of Gingrich revolution in Congress in the 1990s. And now you have a third one. But the question that's open right now is whether there's going to be an intelligentsia, similar to sort of people like James Burnham and Whittaker Chambers in the 1950s, similar to people like Irving Kristol in the 1970s. Where is the intelligentsia going to come from today for the Trumpian nationalist right? And I think the only place it can possibly come from is from within. Can it generate its own kind of nationalist intelligentsia? There's also actually, kind of interestingly enough, there are people who had been on the right in the 1980s, then moved to the left in the 1990s, and who now in some respects seem to be moving back to the right. Michael Lind, for example, at the New America Foundation, is a key example of this. He's sort of a left nationalist or a left Buchananite who became very critical of conservatives in the 1990s, but now in many ways could almost serve as a brain for a sort of more moderate or more polished version of Donald Trump. You see it also with John Gray in the United Kingdom. John Gray had been a sort of Hayekian, free market, libertarian type in the 1980s. Then he becomes very critical of the right in general during the 1990s. He moves to the left. He's also critical of sort of New Labor and Tony Blair and whatnot. But now John Gray is again, I think, in many ways, kind of simpatico with the direction that the Brexit right and the American right as well is taking. So you may, in fact, there may be an endogenous sort of intelligentsia that arises out of Trumpism, perhaps, whether it's someone like Michael Anton, for example, or someone who hasn't been identified yet. Or you could perhaps actually have some of these people who've gone right, left, right, wind up becoming very important to a kind of Trumpian movement in the future. But it's an open question, and it's something I think that is one of the key questions for the American right going forward. It's clear that the populism right now is not going to disappear. It's clear that the conservative grassroots is not going to suddenly become moderate or suddenly become readopt the George W. Bush style, both of politics and also the George W. Bush programmatic agenda. It's clear that the populist right is here to stay. The question is what kind of mind it will have, who will lead it, what intelligentsia will be connected with it. And if it doesn't have one, then perhaps it will suffer a collapse, or perhaps it will be sort of able to exist on muscle alone without brain.
Thank you.
Good. I'm going to be briefer because I'm not as well informed as my colleagues here are about the history of American politics. On the other hand, I've lived it. When I was a kid, when I was about 16 or 17, I was what I call now a Joan Baez Marxist. I sang all the labor songs. I still now know many more labor songs than my friends on the left, and embarrass them that way. Then I went to college and became an economics major and became a Keynesian, because that was what was on offer in the early 1960s, and scorned my roommate, an engineer, who used to read the great Austrian economist Mises' Human Action. He would read that in between solving second-order differential equations. He was an engineer, as I said, but I was a Keynesian, and then I became a kind of an economic engineer, and my politics was always to this day, my politics is about helping the poor, period. That's all it is. Yet what happened is that I kept changing my opinion about what would help the poor. When I was very young, it was actually my first politics was Prince Kropotkin, the great Russian anti-capitalist anarchist. And I still find him somewhat attractive. My first vote in 1964 was for Johnson against Barry Goldwater. So you can see, and then I went to graduate school and became an applied economist, being interested in economic history. And then I got a job at the University of Chicago, this place down here a ways, and was in the economics department there for 12 years. Before that, I had started to understand that the economics could be applied to the world, most particularly the world of the dead, the past. I'm an economic historian. But I worked for George McGovern when he was a candidate in 1972. So you can see I'm kind of a confused, slowly moving to the right, conventionally called. It's extremely hard. I think John Gray is a kind of a bizarre example. He's also a crazy environmentalist, among other things. But it's very hard to find people who moved from understanding capitalism, markets, to becoming socialists. It basically doesn't happen. Whereas the other movement, from being a socialist and being, as you are, a social democrat, to seeing the light, is vastly more common. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of intellectuals in the 20th century, or non-intellectuals for that matter, who made this transition. So by now, I'm calling myself a humane libertarian, or more exactly, a humane liberal. Because the word, and I want to quarrel with my colleagues here a bit. We're all aligned, everyone else except me, along this conventional spectrum that we talk about all the time, as though it were kind of a complete guide, kind of slide rule of politics, left to right. And people say, I'm a man of the left, I'm a woman of the right, you know, and they think that kind of settles it. And my colleagues here are much more sophisticated about this than most people are. But still, left, right, it's a journalistic trope. As a classical liberal, which is what I am, John Stuart Mill type liberal, or more to the point, an Adam Smith type liberal. I'm often called conservative, but you know, I'm not a conservative. I'm transgendered, in case you didn't know. You know, I'm fond of saying I've been everything. I've been a socialist. I've been a man. I've been everything. So that I want us to consider that there's a more American version of politics. Very interesting example of it. I just read a brilliant biography of Henry David Thoreau. It's called Thoreau, in case you want to get it. And it's one of the best biographies I've ever read in my life. It's astoundingly good. And it turns out that Thoreau, as I didn't know, was a businessman and was a liberal, a classical liberal. And that tradition in American politics has been thrown into the left, thrown into the right, and kind of obscured. And then we hang out with these conservatives who I admire very much, but you know, I don't want to get too close to them. So what the left and the right is about is a debate about how the monopoly of violence of governments should be used. Not, as I would say, a much more interesting question is, should there be a monopoly of violence? Should it not be much smaller? And there, of course, I agree with a lot of my friends on the left. And I have friends on both the left and the right in this conventional way. And so the liberals, as I call myself, the liberals, moi, believe not. We think it's crazy to have a debate between class warfare and foreign invasion, to take two versions of the left and the right. That we shouldn't do Iraq wars on the one hand, but we shouldn't also do massive redistribution on the other. We should leave people alone. And this is how can I say, it's a political position that doesn't have a party home in the United States. And it's strange and disgraceful that it doesn't. One more point. I think as a matter of political history, and I'd be interested in my colleagues' views on this, the big mistake was made by George McGovern, who I said I supported. By the way, I was assigned to watch the voting in a far south side Chicago ward, and they stole the ballot box on me. About 8 o'clock when the voting was finished, I said, where's the ballot box? He said, geez, I don't know. What happened to the ballot box? What had obviously happened is that the machine, who hated George McGovern, had stolen the ballot box, taken it out, thrown away all the McGovern votes. But anyway, that's a minor point. But it's not too minor, because it shows that the correctly used word liberalism, which is what I liked about George McGovern, his opposition to the war in Vietnam in particular, is kind of cast to the side in American politics in a way that's very unnatural. The United States is naturally a liberal place. That was the founding myth of the United States. Tocqueville and people like that talked about the United States in those terms. It wasn't socialist, it wasn't conservative, although of course socialism and conservatism were going on. But the big mistake was by George McGovern to insist that there be more primaries, that there be more voting for who would become the candidate in the major parties. And this became all the rage, and it was, I believe it was stupid. And it was resulted in this very strong division between the two parties. You know, very often people said, oh, you can't tell the difference between Rockefeller and Kennedy or something, and that's true. They were very close. And what's happened is that the only people who go to the polls for these damn primaries are nutcases of various sorts. And the result is that both parties have gone off the rail in both directions. So that's my complaint and worry, and I don't know what to do about it. You know, the Blackstone Hotel downtown, about 4 blocks from where I live, is the smoke-filled room. Are you aware of that? It was in the Blackstone Hotel in 1920 that the Republicans, in a literally smoke-filled room, decided on Warren Harding, the second worst president we've ever had, as the candidate for the Republican Party. So that's my contribution here.
All right, so the text that I came up with is called Fear of Politics. And, some of it might be a little, I think I'm gonna, a couple of times I didn't put it all together. I didn't do enough revising, 'cause I was told about this very recently, but let me sort of try to read through it. So I recently read an op-ed that was widely shared by friends and acquaintances, but whose perspective seemed to me, well, deranged. Written by Fintan O'Toole for the Irish Times earlier this summer, around the time the news cycle about family separations at the border was winding down. It was titled, "Trial Runs for Fascism in Full Flow." The subheading read, "Babies in cages were no mistake by Trump, but test marketing for barbarism." Just to be absolutely clear, the fact that I am criticizing this specific editorial does not mean I am a supporter of Donald Trump, and much less of our government's monstrous treatment of immigrant workers and their families. In Trial Runs for Fascism in Full Flow, O'Toole argues that the separation of families at the border is an anticipation of a future Holocaust-like atrocities. In his view, the separation policy was a political experiment to test whether the American public would approve further steps to dehumanize and eventually exterminate Mexican and Central American immigrants. Without mentioning the fact that it was an ACLU lawsuit that brought the policy to an end, O'Toole writes, "The reason the family separation stopped was that the experiment ended. The results were in, and they were quite satisfactory. 58% of Republicans approved of this brutality, and Trump's overall approval ratings are up by 43%. For O'Toole, these Trump supporters, along with Brexit voters, whom he throws unceremoniously into the mix, are being gradually and deliberately brainwashed into obedient and bloodthirsty beasts. You have to, he writes, you have to undermine moral boundaries. You have to inure people to the acceptance of acts of extreme cruelty. Like hounds, people have to be blooded. They have to be given a taste for savagery. Having lived my life in the United States and Mexico, I didn't know the phrase blooding a hound. As it turns out, it is a step in training dogs for fox hunting. How aristocratic. In his editorial about dehumanization, Lord Fintan O'Toole mixes his metaphors. From targets of test marketing, Trump supporters are further downgraded to bloodthirsty dogs. I wonder what he thought was happening at the border before Trump. Does he think it was some sort of open border before Trump came around? O'Toole is an arts journalist and a longtime liberal political columnist at the Irish Times, a responsible centrist voice of the establishment. But he really does not seem to be very informed about immigration in the United States. Does he know about the militarization of border security and how it is a bipartisan project carried through the Bush administration? Does he understand that under Obama, it was Democrats who decided not to push for an immigration reform bill supported by both parties? Does he know that also under Obama, unaccompanied minors placed in detention centers were put in cages? Does O'Toole understand that it was under Obama that ICE began collaborating with local law enforcement agencies? That thanks to Democratic Party-supported legislation going back to the Clinton administration, undocumented immigrants stopped for a DUI can end up facing deportation. If his concern is family separation, has O'Toole given any thought to the struggling parents who get their children taken away by child protection services? These are US citizens. This how-aboutism that I'm practicing is, once again, not about defending Donald Trump and his zero-tolerance policy, but about pointing out just how bizarre O'Toole's apocalyptic worldview is. What is this paranoid despair about? I think it has very little to do with the suffering of the actual victims. The real message in the editorial is that millions of Americans are no better than stupid, bloodthirsty good dogs. Mm-hmm. This is a far more extreme political position than, say, Trump's tariff barriers as a negotiation tactic. O'Toole is a mouthpiece for a certain kind of educated liberal elite sentiment. As Thomas Frank has observed, in America, this demographic, a professional managerial elite, have become the base of the Democratic Party and the target audience of this kind of overwrought anti-Trumpism. This kind of neoliberal intelligentsia is invested in a vague notion of progress by means of free markets and, more importantly, by means of expert management and cool-headed administration. This worldview has been thrown into crisis by the recent unpredictable behavior of the voting public in the last presidential elections and the Brexit vote, as well as the general growing popularity of politicians that are called anti-establishment populists. These events may be the beginning of a political realignment toward some new kind of post-neoliberalism that we don't yet understand. So far in the United States and the UK, this realignment has not yet led to pogroms or government-approved mass violence of any sort. Violence against immigrants right now is being committed not by Trump supporters, but by an increasingly brutal security apparatus that has steadily grown more massive for the past 30 years or so. Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, each one has made it worse. And yet, elite liberals like O'Toole put the blame not on the state, but on a voting public which they see as ignorant and animalistic. The sentiment O'Toole is expressing is a new apocalyptic and misanthropic turn of professional managerial technocracy, a worldview that sees the political passions of regular people as extremely dangerous, not only to the current political establishment, but beyond that, to the very foundations of our global civilization. In discussions about authoritarian politics, people often throw around the cliched phrase, the politics of fear. But what I'm talking about here is the fear of politics. The loathing of mobilized majorities is not just a thing of frou-frou fox hunting theater critics either. The self-avowed radical left has run with it too. At a recent counter-protest in Portland, some Antifa kids beat up a fellow counter-protester, one of their own, because he was carrying an American flag, which they viewed as a symbol of white supremacy. The flag is, of course, anything but that, representing as it does the victory of the Union over the Southern slavocracy. I fear that that what Antifa actually hate about it is that it is a symbol of democratic nationhood for millions of people, immigrants and children of immigrants. Their only politics is a radicalized version of Democratic Party messaging, made as edgy as possible. While the professional managerials worry about the coming cataclysm, Antifa are ready to put on their road warrior gear and live out their post-apocalyptic fantasy. Earlier this month, they came out in force for the big white supremacist demonstration, Unite the Right. But the whole national white supremacist gathering consisted of no more than a couple dozen internet dweebs on parade. I wonder if the Antifa counter-protesters were glad to see that the fascist threat was not real, or were they disappointed? Why do they want to resist fascism so bad when there is no real fascist movement in the United States? People talk about political polarization, but what I see is something more like post-political paranoia. The blue state fear of creeping fascism after 2016 is little different psychologically from the red state fear of an Islamist precedent after 2008. Fantastic fear of change, narcissistic preoccupation with identity, the projection of the worst imaginable intentions onto the minds of people whose minds we don't know. There is something adolescent about it. Beneath Fintan O'Toole's ominous intonations about bloody fascist hounds, it is easy to hear him saying, "This is the worst thing ever. Everyone is against me. My life is over. I wish the world would end." I believe that this is the subpolitical anxiety characteristic of our neoliberal age. Like teenagers, we are sensitive to change and preoccupied about the future. In our endless introspections, we see ourselves as self-determining adults, but feel vulnerable and have little control, and feel like we have little control over the big decisions that shape our lives. As a polity, we are like high schoolers living at home with our parents. Without the rigors and responsibilities of self-government, we become paranoid and histrionic. In his recent book, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, Quinn Slobodian argues that the neoliberal project was not primarily about freeing up trade or deregulating the economy. It was about regulating global politics. It did not mean less government, but more, a whole new layer of supranational institutions meant to insulate global economic forces from democratic rule and popular accountability. Neoliberal reforms in the past 40 years may have presented themselves as an aspiration to an international civil society, but represented, in fact, an attack on the ability of civil society to determine its future by means of political deliberation. An apparatus of rules and regulations was put in place to discipline democratically elected national governments. As the 20th century became the 21st, political elites were changing their views of what government meant, what governing meant. They were accountable first and foremost to the international order and only secondarily responsible to their constituencies at home. The recent post-Cold War democratizations of the 1990s were so easily embraced by ruling classes everywhere was that democracy was now a parenthetical proposition. 21st century technocratic elites have largely abandoned the notion that political deliberation and political conflict expresses the contradictory collective will of civil society. They don't see civil society at all, but a cloud of atomized individuals pursuing their rational self-interest, though they're always frustrated about how irrational these atoms are. They no longer see themselves as responsible representatives of society's aspirations to transform itself. Instead, they hope to better follow the rules and regulations of supranational governance by predicting the future political behavior of millions of individuals. Predicting the future is not easy, however, so politicians turn to more surveillance, more data, more predictive models, commitment to a platform, judgment from experience, political cunning. These kinds of things are now seen as totally unreliable. The politicians with the best resumes and the most innovative consulting firms become so evidence-based that they cannot do anything but follow the rules and take care of their public image. These elites have lost their ability to exercise leadership. The appeal of Barack Obama was that he could play the role of an inspired leader while doing more or less the same as other politicians around him. He invented a new kind of pseudo-leadership. His bully pulpit was neither persuasive nor combative, but aspirational. He presented himself as a role model, educated and successful, truly socially liberal in his heart of hearts, but moderate and balanced in his politics. He was only responsible for his own individual performance, not for his party, not for his voters, and not for American society. A concept that I am sure, American society, I mean, a concept that I am sure he believes is an empty abstraction. Obama figured out how to not be held responsible. For his many supporters, the question was not, will he live up to his promise? It was, will America live up to his example? There is a corollary here, of course. If after 8 years, America did not become more educated, successful, and socially liberal, it must mean America did not deserve Barack Obama. We did not deserve Barack Obama is actually a widely held belief among American liberals. The contempt it expresses for the nation and its people is a big part of why the Democratic Party is in trouble. Today's realignment means that after a decade-long recession, neoliberalism can no longer present itself as good management. As awareness of mass surveillance and mass incarceration becomes increasingly widespread, it can no longer uphold its claim at having ever been liberal. It was telling how a couple of months after Trump was elected, Xi Jinping was praised at the World Economic Forum for presenting himself as an alternate leader of international capitalism. We should recede from our respective national positions and embark on the right pathway toward economic globalization at the right pace, he intoned. I'm sure many American liberals present at Davos felt great envy at Xi's well-managed police state. I was originally asked to speak about the recent election in Mexico, but I hadn't really had a chance to write anything, or I hadn't really given myself a chance to write anything or speak in public about the strange turn that liberalism has taken in the last couple of years. So I got caught up with writing that. What I can definitely say about the Mexican election is that the thoughts that I just presented earlier were very much shaped by the electoral campaign and victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. What matters about him is not that he is a leftist, but that he managed to defeat Mexico's political establishment, all three parties of it, by presenting himself credibly as a representative of the nation as a whole. It is not his policy platform, but the way that he was able to channel the Mexican people's rejection of all three establishment parties into a simple mandate. Society will not tolerate the corruption and irresponsibility of its self-interested politicians. This is the same, I didn't write this down, but this is the same demand that in 1789 was captured by the ABCs in the term the revolt of the Third Estate. This is for me what is exciting about López Obrador is that he represents the fact that despite the attempt in the last 3 decades to suppress politics with these international rules, the revolt of the Third Estate is not going anywhere. It is baked into the capitalist society. So if you would like to know more about the campaign in Mexico, I'm happy to respond to any questions. And there's an article I'm writing soon.
Thank you.
So at this point, I'd like to invite. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to invite each speaker, starting with Ellie, to go down the line and indicate at least one point that you see as very significant or important that your fellow panelist has made, and then also, if you would indicate perhaps a point of divergence or something that was unclear or a difference in interpretation, a question that you'd like to raise.
Sure. Sure. Actually, gosh, sort of where to start with my. There's so much on the table right now. I think since Marco was the last person, I want to start, and I'll just come back this way. I agree with you with the problem of elitism, and I think you sort of captured it right there. It is really horrendous how actually across the political spectrum, journalists are talking about the American people today, and I completely agree with that, and especially since I think it is inspiring to watch them come to the polls and be energized on a number of issues and to do that. At the same time, there's an interesting way that you kind of undercut your argument about that there's a lot of fear-mongering and actually talking about a lot of the things that we should be worried about going on in the country today and around the world. And that it isn't just coming from the people themselves, but it is also a part of the things that elected leaders are actually doing, and entrenched bureaucracies as well. But I think in some ways you kind of undercut yourself that there's reason why people are making these arguments about what we're sort of seeing that you should be sort of careful about, and especially this dismissal about the concerns. And I know Deirdre was going to talk about fascism. Maybe she will in these comments. I look to the great historian of fascism, Paxton, in his 5 stages of fascism, to look at understanding that particular ism, which was so hard to define, and finding actually as much as with classical liberalism, classical conservatism, that these are actually creatures of the industrial era. And he found it with fascism too. And it's a really interesting way with his idea of thinking about 5 stages where you can see across time and across place around the world in terms of thinking why that might be an actual helpful framework for us to think about what's happening globally in Western democracies right now, and to be alarmed. With Deirdre, oh my gosh, I completely agree with you that the worst thing in American politics is this idea that we are left or right or Democrat or Republican, when we are much more complicated as a polity. We are much more complicated individually, and how we act together, and it is one of those things that actually deadens discussions. And indeed, one of the things that I challenge my students, there's a fantastic study political scientists did, actually it's almost 60 years ago, trying to figure out what makes an American voter tick. And they found out that it was like 2 to 3 things. Unfortunately, everyone has a different 2 to 3 things. And then when they replicated that, no, but it's actually a very charming sort of write-up about it, is that, everyone thinks that they're such an informed voter, but when you push yourself on it, you can really only follow 2 to 3 things, right, in detail. And the question becomes, what are those 2 to 3 things? And I challenge my students when I present this, because they repeated the look at it 10 years ago and found the same thing. Everyone is still, even though we seem so much more informed with social media and the internet and everything like that, it's still like 2 to 3 things. Can you go home and start a discussion with people about politics without asking about politics, without saying Democrat, Republican, left or right, and say, what are the 3 things that matter to you? And I think that that's a really inspiring way of moving forward and thinking about things. I will say, though, point of disagreement, I know many American leftists who have stayed on the left. I mean, they trained me. So, yeah. But then, thinking about these issues, I think for me that's my point of agreement that I think the 70s were an important decade. As much as a historian, you can sort of see the way that I think about things. I don't like this idea that American history should go decade by decade, because a lot of those undercurrents you could see coming in the 60s. But for me, I think what's happening in the 70s is the idea that the issues that people cared about were changing. And that's the most important thing. And the way that I think about these, so important in the 60s, the Democrats ceded the economic agenda to the right when both John F. Kennedy and LBJ signed into national law the kind of tax breaks which just sort of started the snowball at the federal level, what had been doing in the state and local level to give more money back to corporations. They started rebalancing, getting more towards regressive taxation. That is when, and then of course the knife in the back, one of many, the knife in the back in '64 with LBJ to organize labor when he refused to repeal 14B, the archetype for right to work laws. It's all over. And then of course it opens the door for what we label as social issues. But look, a lot of things that we label as social issues are actually economic and political issues in different things. You can't talk about even something as incendiary as abortion as not being an economic issue for women who have to choose between having a baby and having a career, or even just being able to sustain their family, especially since women are increasingly more and more likely to be either the head or the sole income earner in a household or the breadwinner in the trajectory of what's going on with the American labor market over the past 40 years. All right.
I have a point of order, as we used to say. I think it's important that we don't talk so much. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean you in particular. I talk too much. We all talk too much because that's our job. Mm-hmm. But we should get the audience involved as quickly as we can. And the format, which I was kind of dubious about anyway, of pointing out one thing you agree with and disagree, that's too complicated. We'll be here at midnight. So let's try to get down where we're talking to.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Professor McCloskey on that point, and I'll go with the format and say a few brief remarks. But I agree that the audience interaction will be the most interesting element here. I don't necessarily disagree with very much again of the analysis and the timeline that Professor Shermer developed. I think it's quite accurate for the most part, and I'm trying to think of whether there's anything in the analysis per se that I think misses the mark. But I'm not sure that it does. I mean, that was kind of an overview based on, sort of 4 pivotal elections. Professor Shermer had criticized me a little bit for going by decade, and I think that's fair. But on the other hand, you can also, make the same criticism about going by pivotal elections. As you're correct to point out, these are, these are streams that, sort of add up and become much larger rivers at different points in their bends over time. And both elections and decades are sort of crude but still useful way stations or points on the map. And I guess I would defend the left-right spectrum a little bit and the ideas of conservatism, liberalism, progressivism, other hackneyed ideas, which nonetheless are useful in at least giving people language that they can use as a point of reference. You never want to get to a point where you're so dogmatic or you're so locked into some sort of formal definition of these things that it's impossible to understand the actual fluidity of American politics and of world politics. But on the other hand, it is useful just to have a shorthand and to be able to discuss things without having to give a sort of dissertation-length explanation of the precise historical sort of ebbs and flows before being able to discuss something. And obviously that's not what anyone here was trying to say in criticizing the left-right spectrum. The left-right spectrum can be, overused, and it has been. But I do think it still has a degree of utility. I agree so much with what Marco said that, again, there's not really anything I would draw out as a primary point of conflict. I think he's entirely correct that you have a basically liberal establishment, if I may use that term without incurring Professor McCloskey's wrath, but a liberal establishment that, it has this ideology. It says on the label that it's one thing, which is a small government, pro-freedom, we treat everyone equally kind of approach, but that in practice actually is wedded to state power, and that's the case, everywhere throughout our civilization. And both the populist right and also the Bernie Sanders left, these are both uprisings against this liberal establishment, which has, since the Cold War, come to really resent the idea that it's going to have any kind of competition. And it delegitimizes that competition with this rhetoric of violence. And you see it not only with respect to Brexit and with respect to the Trump election, you see it also a little bit, well, actually more than a little bit, with respect to delegitimizing Bernie Sanders in various ways. But you also see it, of course, in Europe, where the European Union is sort of par excellence the model of this new kind of depoliticized administrative rule. There's an important new book which I don't totally agree with, but I think is worth reading in this context. It's by an Israeli political scientist by the name of Yoram Hazony, and his book is called The Virtue of Nationalism. It's about to be released in October. Actually, no, in September, so a few weeks from now. And it's quite well worth looking at as a defense of nationalism, as something which really is democratic, something which really is, the alternative to imperialism and the alternative to sort of administrative excess. With respect to Deirdre's remarks, I like very much the ideal of liberalism. And what I worry about, however, is that especially libertarians, when they talk about liberalism, and I don't think Deirdre really, is an offender here, certainly not to the degree that most others are. But a great many libertarians, when they talk about liberalism, when they talk about their idea of freedom and having, sort of less coercion and so forth, they're imagining a sort of blank slate. They're imagining a year zero where you don't already have institutions and rather delicate balances of power between those institutions, between, different mindsets and different attitudes. So it seems to me that the complexity of the world that we live in and inherit, and this again I think speaks to my background as a conservative, but we start out with a very complex, inheritance. And being able to figure out how to take that inheritance, how to take our starting position, which is already sort of muddied and compromised, and make the most of that to maintain the good things while also, sort of improving and not sacrificing one for the other, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, requires a lot of deviation actually from a kind of libertarian formula. that especially when it comes to the foundations of our economics, and here perhaps I agree with Professor Shermer again, whether it's abortion or whether it's anything else, there is an economic dimension, and there is a dimension not just of economics, but also of the relationship between economics and psychology, which is one of the things that Professor McCloskey, writes quite eloquently about in all of her works. So when we think about trade, when we think about immigration, we think about all of these things, there are many dimensions there that have to be taken into account sensitively, and you have to look at why people, are very concerned about their status and have the feeling that their jobs, for example, are endangered, and have the feeling that their political voice is being removed by a sort of administrative set of preferences that they don't get to have a democratic say in.
Well, I certainly agree that, that's all right, what do I agree with? I agree that one of the big problems is the modern state and its increase. It's bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have super states. By the way, I did a review of that book that you talked about. But that's kind of my point, that the right-left spectrum, we have to stop calling socialists liberals. They're not. They're socialists, and they should be proud of it. I was a socialist, I was proud of it. Let's go with it. It's socialism. Socialism is the theory of the big state in aid of the proletariat. Conservatism tends to be the theory of the big state in support of the existing hierarchies of the society. I just reviewed a book on this very matter, how liberalism failed, let's not get into the details here, but a humane liberalism, not, as you said, the kind of mechanical economics is all view. I don't agree with that. Once I did, I've been everything. Now I don't. That accepts that we're French or American or Chicagoans or women or whatever as part of our lives. That enriched liberalism is such a contrast to the debate over how to use massive state power. On both the left and the right, they want to increase it. And as a famous cartoon in the New Yorker once put it, this boy in a high chair, outraged by the food that his mother had provided, was screaming, "I say it's spinach, and I say to hell with it." And I say that the left-right thing that we're caught in is wrong. We should have free societies. For example, I think we should have free migration, if you want to know how extreme I am on this point. I think it's absurd that we have national borders of any sort. On the other hand, we have got an identity, but it shouldn't be protected with violence through the state. I tried to be brief, but as someone famously said, I didn't have time to be brief.
Just since I see everybody kind of beating on the left-right spectrum, I would say that the problem is not the terms or the notion of left and right. It is that at some point in the 20th century, the left stopped functioning. It collapsed. It died. The left is dead. There is no proper organized left. There is no socialist left. What we usually sort of replace for it is a Republican and Democratic Party that are both statist, right-wing parties serving the same lobbyists with different sort of advertising strategies for different sort of cultural tastes. So, you know, there's no sort of real political conflict there. What there is this sort of advertising competition. You know, as far as the sort of atrocities or the things that I'm not bringing up, I'm very worried. I'm always concerned. I brought up all the ways that you know, both parties have added to a state apparatus that increasingly criminalizes immigration and poverty and all these things. This is a bipartisan project. So, you know, what I would say is that the left is dead, and that having replaced it with the sort of, you know, born in the 1960s and 1970s, these sort of two cultural flavors, you know, a kind of elite, liberal, coastal style of being, and a kind of heartland kind of style of being. You know, these very small sort of issues that people are very attached to, in comparison with major issues of the state and governance and who holds power in society. Both parties support the same people, who, you know, the same power holders. What you have is these two political parties that are both right-wing, just have different sort of bases.
I want to hear from the audience.
Yeah.
I'm tired of hearing questions.
Yes, so at this point, we will take audience Q&A. So if you could please step right up here, and I will pass my mic to you. You can pose your question. Please try to pose your question in about a minute. And please know that your question will appear to viewers at home and online on the recording that CAN TV is generating. So if you want to come up right here.
I kind of have a question that goes towards Mr. McCarthy and Dr. Shermer. It's kind of going back to the post-World War II era. But for Dr. Shermer, what do you make of Strom Thurmond and Wallace and the way that they kind of start to split the Democratic Party after World War II and into the 60s over that course of 20 years? And then for Mr. McCarthy, you made a point that the Vietnam War is a big point of contention in the 68, but what do you make of law and order in the 1960s and how the Republicans handle that?
Thanks for the question. I'm actually going to use this time to say that you should know that I call all 20th century historians on focusing on a single decade. It drives me crazy that we call ourselves historians and many of us want to just focus on one decade. So it was not about you at all when I said that. So in terms of this question about what happens with the Democrats, I have to say, you know, Southern Democrats are actually quite an interesting phenomenon across the 20th century. There's actually many left-wing radical ones that people forget about. One of my favorites is a man named Aubrey Williams, who actually voted for Norm Thomas, the socialist, in 1932, but ended up being one of the most far left-wing members of the New Deal and actually a Roosevelt insider. But with Strom Thurmond and Wallace, I mean, that's a fascinating thing, is you have two men who are both doing third-party independent runs at two different times, 48 and 68. That's very interesting. And then Thurmond, of course, leaves the party. Wallace never does. Well, he'll come back in, of course, right? So he comes back in. And the thing is, why Wallace isn't my favorite of the Democrats who never change party. There's other ones who actually never actually resign their membership. One of the most famous ones, people don't really know much about him, but he's actually a very influential governor of North Carolina, a man named Luther Hodges, who was Kennedy's Commerce Secretary. And his politics were identical to Barry Goldwater's, but he never felt the need to make that shift. And I think that that's where you can see how the Democratic Party has always had a conservative wing. Many of its Southerners that have actually maintained for a very long period of time that we don't focus on, you know, the sort of brevity of what could be included within the Democratic Party. And some of it is tradition. I mean, still to this day, you're more likely to vote the way that your parents or your surrounding community does than anywhere else. That's the sort of easiest predictor for that. It's not so, and the other reason, and it goes to party registration, when people stopped, we have declining numbers of people in the American parties, referring to something Deirdre talked about, that really what you're left with, who turns out on the primaries, are the fire-breathing ones who get the extremists. They don't necessarily register for the other party. The great example of this, and this is actually something that was at the thorn in McCain's side throughout his career in Arizona, and was at the end of Goldwater's career in Arizona. So he kind of inherited from Goldwater these right-wing populists. Arizona became a solid Republican state in terms of voting by 1958. It didn't have a larger number of registered Republicans than Democrats until 1984 because of that phenomenon about how slow it was to actually build up the party numbers after, from 58 to 84, because people just didn't either feel the need to re-register, or when they did distance themselves from the Democratic Party, it was that they didn't necessarily register for the Republicans. And that's a symptom of actually that uncomfortableness with the Goldwater and then the McCain conservatism.
Wallace was very important for the populist right in the 1970s. Now, in '68, you might think that Wallace, given his background with the Democratic Party, would have been seen as kind of a threat to the Democrat, but that was not the case. In fact, Nixon was very, very worried that Wallace was going to get to his right and cost him the election. What you see in the 1970s, and again, I don't want to go decade by decade, but it actually does happen in the 1970s. There are a number of conservative populists. First of all, Nixon himself ideologically is very hard to pin down. He does all sorts of very odd things. He creates the EPA for one thing. He actually amplifies. Affirmative action was just getting started before him. He extends it. He either creates or amplifies the Office of Equal Opportunity, but he does it in for a very Machiavellian reason, most historians would say, which is that by creating this office, he actually kind of stokes white resentment, and then that's going to ultimately kind of flow back to support Nixon. So whether that's true or not, it's certainly you couldn't put anything past Richard Nixon. So. The relationship between Vietnam and law and order, I think, gets very blurred, and oftentimes, in politics, we are in analyzing politics, we're limited to looking at responses to surveys and other kinds of social science instruments. But really, I mean, the mix of issues that people have in their minds and how they connect sort of national glory and strength abroad with the idea of order at home and a nation you can be proud of, I think is something that always has to be kept in mind, regardless of what opinion surveys might show us. I think it's probably not a surprise, actually, that law and order becomes an issue again with Donald Trump after we have the experience of the Iraq War. There seems to be this idea of, if we're losing abroad, there must be some sort of flaw at home, and it must be some sort of, that if we're facing a threat abroad, that there also must be some sort of threat at home. I think there's a continuity there and a psychological consistency, even if it's not something that really makes logical sense. The way the emotions fit together has to be taken into account. I should say, with respect to Wallace, there are a lot of conservatives who are disappointed by Richard Nixon, and going into the 1970s, they looked to Wallace as someone who built up a third party that was more or less at least a potential right-wing movement. And they want to create a new third party. In the late 1970s, people like Bill Rusher, for example, who's the publisher of National Review, they're despairing of the Republican Party. They have the same view of the Republican Party that Southern Democrats have of the Democratic Party at that point. And Bill Rusher actually wants to start a third party on the right, a populist third party, to oppose the Republicans. And the election of Ronald Reagan winds up defusing this, because Reagan's a right-wing enough candidate that all the air is let out of the balloon for a third party right-wing movement. And thereafter, it really never gets back to that point. Ross Perot sort of dabbled in third-party politics. You had the creation of something called originally the U.S. Taxpayers Party, which later becomes the Constitution Party. But that was created in 1992 as a vehicle for a potential Pat Buchanan independent party run. All of these things fall short, but Wallace kind of gave a lot of populists in the 1970s the idea that you could have a movement that would split off from the Republican Party on the right.
I have a general question because of lack of background to an extent. The issue of conservative intelligentsia that may or may not be appearing the issue of fascism. That is, I guess the idea of American exceptionalism being converted to American essentialism. And this would, I guess, also include the conservative Christian right, Bannon. Also the speech that Trump gave in Poland. I just remember one quote, something about the job of the West is to maintain its culture, something along those lines. Do you see a potentially fascistic intellectual influence, possibly a Europeanization of the American conservative intellectual agenda on the horizon?
This is a very old theme in American politics, surprisingly old. In the late 19th century, you have people in the United States worrying about the white race and its survival. And one of the prominent politicians of this was Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, there's this what we now regard as this loony talk about races. The great Immigration Commission of 1910 had something like 300 races, including the Georgia cracker race. It was complete crazy stuff, and it is one of the constant themes of when imperialism fails, so to speak. This arouses this fear that we whites are under attack, and you see it in this guy Bannon, and it's very sad.
If I may have something.
Go ahead.
You can see the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Sure. Sure. Just akin to that sort of idea of the Europeanization or the sort of defense of Western society and the Europeanization and stuff. I mean, there's a way where it was a Marshall Plan, or that was the first American politics, that were there to preserve European culture against the threat of this was again a bipartisan project against the threat of communism. So a lot of what we have as sort of right-wing defenses of European nationalities or identity, a lot of that comes from anti-communism.
That's an interesting point. Let's hear from someone else.
My question is
Hold it up to your mouth.
my question is more related to political realignment and how socialists, that's what I was getting to, how socialists reconcile the fact that fascism itself was birthed from those who were socialists. The Nazi Party itself was the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party. And I just, because I have a lot of friends who proclaim to be socialists and proclaim against fascism, I don't understand how they can do that and not see the fault in history that has produced.
My way of expressing this is that there have been the intellectuals in the West in the last 3 centuries have three ideas: liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. And of the three, the only ones that makes any sense at all to me is the first, the equality of humans. The other two, as you point out, if you like nationalism and you like socialism, maybe you'll like National Socialism.
Well, on the flip side, there's a tendency of any political movement, especially one such as the Nazis trying to seize power, simply to take whatever popular themes might be out there and to prostitute them. So the Nazis saw an advantage in styling themselves as socialists. They also saw an advantage in styling themselves as nationalists. And I think it's a mistake to say that any nationalist or any socialist is therefore, in some ways, a cousin of the Nazis. With respect to the previous question about fascism, I think it's interesting. I mean, there is on the right, and I know this from experience, a rising sense of anti-imperialism, a rising anti-liberal imperialism. So it's, on the one hand, you can say it's great because it's anti-war. I think the left would like that. On the other hand, the fact that it's also a little bit anti-liberal and says, we're not responsible for massacres in other countries. We're not responsible for exporting, human rights. That's something that certainly parts of the left would find a little troubling. But it seems to me that one of the key components of fascism has to be war, has to be a valorization of the military. And in some ways, you're seeing a move away from that on the American populist right now. The fact that Donald Trump would say the things he said about John McCain and his war record shows that some air has been let out of the balloon of sort of worship of militarism. And it's actually the liberals right now and the sort of centrists who are talking about McCain as if he were a secular saint.
I also want to add in that, the gold standard in understanding fascism as a broad ideology and not just reducing it down to Nazism, because of course fascism was Italy, is Paxton. Right. Okay. But looking at Paxton's 5 stages of fascism, which really sort of lay out it as a historical process, is a much better way of sort of understanding it, and also the difficulty people had at the time and still now in understanding the difference of it. Look, and the thing is that I think the great example of that is the fascist door being open here in the 1930s in the United States, with Huey Long and the Share Our Wealth clubs across the country. Yes, and Father Coughlin here at Midwestern, our radio priest. And then, of course, we had a massive fascist rally right here in Chicago. And to look at those kinds of dynamics to understand specifically what happened here, and that's the genius of Sinclair Lewis. Sinclair Lewis wasn't just a novelist, he was a social critic. And his idea of it can't happen here showed how fascism could draw on American traditions and values to produce something, again, with actually very focused on the military as well, and the militarism and the masculinity and that kind of stuff. So we have really interesting examples of understanding where that fascist impulse has been here in the past, understanding what is and is on the table right now in 2018.
As a basic history, as a basic historical point, socialism was in a complete state of crisis when fascism came about. That crisis came from the collapse of the Second International with World War I, and there was the socialists shot themselves in the foot after having 20 or 30 years, but more, 30, 40 years of representing democracy. They were the social democrats of Europe. They shot themselves in the foot by supporting the war, and this is what split the movement into socialists and communists. It was very easy after the trauma of the war to wage war on communists because people were scared of Bolshevism. It was a strange foreign thing, and yes, a lot of the socialists became fascists, but they were anti-communists, and that had to do with the political crisis of around World War I and the Russian Revolution. I mean, I think it's weird to me that people were, talking so much about fascist ideology without talking about that basic history that sets up the relationship between socialism and fascism.
I agree.
While I did find all the initial presentations incredibly stimulating, what I found missing at first was a true explanation for why these various shifts that the first 2 speakers pointed to and throughout the 20th century actually occurred. So that what I found missing. What became clear, or a point that was raised then later on through the last 2 speakers, was the centrality of the state and state power in American political history. Professor Shermer, you had, so maybe one of the issues that I think came out of these presentations was the stark difference between state and civil society, not only in American political history at this point, because in the EU is a vast sort of administrative apparatus too that has accumulated immense powers. So that leaves the question of can civil society generate political forces out of its own volition, or do we always have to wait for these shifts in these larger camps to occur? Last point, I think the most interesting political phenomenon that was pointed to from my perspective was in Professor Shermer's presentation about the Debsian Socialist Party. In a way, the socialism of that Second International moment was one that understood workers, liberal intellectuals to be ones who actually drove civil society, and that the idea that socialists relied on the state and state power became sort of a phenomenon of the 20th century. Yeah, that's mostly just an observation. But
yeah, but actually, I'm glad you made it, because like one of the things that and thinking about the previous question about concerns about this coming from Europe, these ideas coming from Europe, Debs was from Terre Haute, Indiana. He was a Protestant, and actually, he's just as much. He had no religious affiliation to an organized church, but he was very much a Protestant, and he saw himself as much a Christian as a citizen. And actually, and it goes against that whole idea that radicalism was from some foreign shore in America, that we had our own versions of it. But the one thing I'll say, I actually, there is this, when I wrestle with the idea of thinking about it, my allusion to what I think of setting up this 20th century realignment is the corporate reconstruction of American capitalism. We went from a country, focused mostly on small landowners for the most part, with the exception of the Plantation South. How do we deal with the fact that we are now doing with corporate wealth? And what does that mean for the political realignment and for civil society? So for me, it really is grounded into the economic transformations that are so important in setting up the 20th century. But I think the 20th century story is, and it is related, is a growth and growth and growth of the government at all three levels. And what's really frustrating, I think, in the American context, you ask Americans what federalism means. I do it every semester. And they say, what's that the national government does to you? No, it is still the balance of powers. And I have to tell you, the greatest teachable moment, and we have to think about this spread at all three levels when we think about Deirdre's concerns about the state. The greatest teachable moment for me is when we have these government shutdowns, which are increasingly periodic. Nothing happens. And I was like, well, let's have a chat about that and talk about why you still don't understand what federalism means. I'll stop there.
My question is kind of like a two-in-one, and it's for the gentleman at the end. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Marco. So back to the reading that you did, about your thoughts on everything earlier. Can you please expound on the statement of being sensitive or too sensitive? In my experience, it has always come from a form of gaslighting, just because I've understood this country as if, if it doesn't benefit all immediately, then it's not meant to benefit one. And then that kind of goes into my second question, when you kind of condemned Obama in regards to being a pseudo leader. And my understanding of just the American dream, though, is it's a very individualistic ideology. So we can only expect so much from him, and also, I believe, all parties, right? So it's, no matter what the party is, I believe it to always be individualistic, just because from my understanding of history in this country, that's always been the base. It's how can I benefit self, and then let's focus on everyone else.
All right, so a couple of things. The first question about people being oversensitive, I didn't really mean that people are oversensitive. I mean, what I think is that since people are not anchored in sort of and this actually relates to Gregor's question. Since people are not anchored in everyday political activity, since there was a depoliticization of society in the last 30, 40 years. I mean, everybody mentioned the decline of political participation. What I think there is a kind of turn away from politics as something that you do to politics as something that is that you are. That is a kind of sort of cultivation of identity and vulnerability, but people are vulnerable, and people do have desires and wishes and stuff like that they want to express that come from who they are. It's just that I feel like, in the turn from party politics, from activity to sort of advertising. It was this sort of narcissism that was mobilized. And this has a lot to do with the way that, you know, a lot of the sort of demands you know, first the civil rights movement, and then the new left sort of were left in the lurch, were sort of abandoned, and then it became a kind of a consumable kind of thing. You know, it was an incomplete process. Another thing about Obama, the problem is, I don't think is that he is, the problem that I have with him is not that you know, individualism. It's that you know, I don't have a problem with him. I think he is just very much expresses the kind of politics, the kind of the kind of political non-activity and preoccupation with sort of image that has sort of become very recently, I think, the sort of the main way that sort of politicians act, and also it's always been strange to me that he, you know, he was very conservative in terms of, like, you know, making big changes or challenging sort of basic sort of policies that existed before him, and yet there is this myth of him as a transformative figure. And I think that if he was a transformative figure, it was in the sense that he presented himself more than anything as a role model. So yeah.
Hello. I am just a reader of books. I have no formal business in speaking about economics, but I have a question about this idea of liberalism. My understanding is that we talk about free markets and the rights of the individual and all of this, but there's a tradition from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, down the line, of the idea that the ground rent would be collected on behalf of the community because they're coming out of a feudal situation where all the land is owned by, you know, a landlord class or whatever. And I feel like we're returning to that situation, but it's veiled because of, you know, now the landlord is the bank, maybe. And so is there a need for a return to this understanding of that the earth itself is not just a commodity, that it is something that the community has some right to?
I understand where you're coming from. The first important American economist was Henry George, who articulated this view 130, 140 years ago. And you're right, among the classical economists, David Ricardo in particular, and then Marx in another way, there's this worry that Thomas Piketty has expressed in our time, that there's this resource, land or capital or something, that this little group of rich people own, and we're all going to get deprived because of that. And it's, as I've argued at some length, it's a completely false story. For one thing, let's just on Henry George, land rents are too small to be a terribly important matter in the distribution of income or in the functioning of the economy. Land rents are about 5% of national income. All land rents, locational, agricultural, mineral, anything you want to name. And so far as the monopoly capital is concerned, much of the capital of the modern world is human capital. It's what we have between our ears. It's what's this institution that surrounds us is producing. It's producing educated people, human capital. And more, there was a time when the bosses owned the factories, and that's where we all worked, with our backs and our hands. But now, the human capital in our heads, which Piketty mentions from time to time and rejects, says he's not going to measure that, is by a very significant margin more important than physical capital.
I guess I want to repose that question and see if anyone else would want to take it up, because I think some of you from other perspectives might have some different takes on it.
Actually, there's a wonderful historian who talked about how much of the 19th century, that we had big government in the 19th century, it was at the state level. And that, no, but the state, but the state exercised enormous police power. And especially actually obliterating the examples that de Tocqueville gave, that those townsfolk actually were required to go. Yeah, everyone can read it themselves, Bill Novak, The People's Welfare. But the whole point of the title of that book was that there was a concern for the people's welfare, and that this is something that the state and the corporations that they chartered were to be done, and we have lost that, I would argue, in the 20th century.
That's a theme of my father, for example, and other former New Dealers in the 40s and 30s who wrote on this matter. And internal improvements. It was a justification of FDR retrospectively. Arthur Schlesinger's The Age of Jackson is an example of this. And quantitatively, it's nuts. The share of national income, however you want to look at it, the reach of the government in the 19th century was vastly smaller than it is now. As what's his name, the great Oklahoma humorist of the 1920s and 30s. Who? Will Rogers said, "Just be glad you don't get the government you pay for."
I'm delighted that we had got a question here from a Georgist perspective. Deirdre McCloskey, of course, mentioned Henry George himself, but there's a long tradition of this line of thought in America, going back at least as far as Tom Paine. One of Tom Paine's pamphlets was Agrarian Justice, and it is in many respects a sort of precursor to Henry George. It's very close. And interestingly enough, Georgism, this philosophy which on the one hand is very free market, it very much endorses free trade, but that has this very skeptical view about land rents and wants to claim them all and redistribute them. But it's actually at the sort of taproot of the intellectual tradition that becomes 20th century libertarianism, because you find people like Albert J. Nock, for example, who are major libertarian heroes now, but who were Georgists at the time. Frank Chodorov also. And Frank Chodorov, interestingly enough, started the organization that publishes the journal that I edit. He was the founder of what was at the time called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. Yeah. That's right, yeah. And now it's changed its name to Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is a little softer. I do want to kind of go off of what Professor McCloskey had said, however, about human capital, because I think this is one of the things that economic nationalists myself, and in fact I'll even put in a brief defense at least of Steve Bannon. I think he certainly considers himself an economic nationalist, not an ethno-nationalist. But the thing that economic nationalists are worried about is precisely our human capital, and the idea that if you look at the modern American service economy, if you look at its major sectors of employment, one of them is retail. Well, retail is not about, sort of great development of human intelligence. Others are things such as healthcare, education. In education, as I think the professors on the panel would attest, the money that is going into education, the growth you're seeing there, is not for professors' salaries. In fact, there's now a rather serious problem where universities are relying on adjuncts who are paid very poorly and given very poor benefits. in place of tenured faculty. So the growth in the education sector, the growth in the healthcare sector, these are sectors, of course, that are deeply penetrated by government. There are in some ways private, public hybrids as opposed to real private sector entities. When you put those together with retail, you get a picture of the modern American service economy, which I think raises some very deep and serious questions about just what we're doing in terms of human capital. And the contrast between us and what you see happening in a place like China, for example, where they really are developing engineers and people who produce things, people who make things and sell them on the world market. It's very alarming in terms of the future that is in store for us.
I just don't think so. I think you're wrong. And again, I urge you to read every page of my book.
We used to invest in our human capital in our universities in a real. We used to invest in our human capital in a much more serious and sustained way. I mean, that's how we built our great university systems, including your employer.
Of course we did. But I don't think that that engineers are the only form of human capital, and I don't think that making things. This is a theme you often hear from people that we've stopped making things in the United States. That for one thing, it's not true. American manufacturing makes more now than it did as a percentage of national income. The output is larger than it's ever been. Its employment is lower than it's ever been, but that's neither here nor there. I'm not at all alarmed at this movement towards services, and actually income per head continues to grow, contrary to what you may have heard in the newspaper.
Marco has. I mean, I don't have a sort of an alternate. Like I don't know enough to disagree here, but the way that I would tend to look at it would be, is it a question of whether we're making things, or is it an economic question, or is it a political question? I worry, like I feel like if it wasn't the state that was actually made smaller, with neoliberalism, then what was it? And I think that what it was this sort of, in all these different ways, this sort of systemic reduction of the sense of management, of sort of responsibility from management downward. This sort of the responsibility there is a, it's what I was trying to say also in relation to Obama, and something I really saw that I really see in the Mexican election. It's this sense of a lack of political responsibility by authorities, right? Like it's sort of accepted that everybody's on their own, and I don't think this is a cause of what's going on, but I think it's an effect of this sort of accumulation of political defeats on the left, of this sort of general sort of depoliticization of society, this reduction of participation. I think it has to do with something like that. I'm not sure though.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That the difference between parties does matter. So, for example, the Janus decision, there's a case where the parties have different approaches, has a direct impact on people's income and future possibilities. And there's a political difference that has an effect on the type of government and the type of state organization that you want.
They can't hear you, by the way. So,
I could repose it, or if someone wants to repose the question.
So, when it appears on TV, there'll be this rumble.
Basically, the issue is, I think there is a significant difference between the parties. They agree on a common framework, that is, that you have to operate within a certain cultural and legal context. But the issue of the Janus decision, where one party is supporting it, a Republican-oriented conservative approach versus the Democratic liberal approach. And the question is, what type of state do you want? And also in terms of popular participation, the Janus decision has also stimulated among certain labor unions, active union members taking the issue into their own hands and volunteering to sign up for the union and making an individual effort.
And I think, the Janus decision is the one that overturned it overturned the collection of the dues, the right, but it's not quite right to work because it's sort of right to work, but it's basically saying that you can't actually have the due. Well, no, but they had, for people who didn't want to join the union, they had to do this. They had to do a small dues just for the maintenance of membership for the cost. Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, but the thing about it is that I think that there actually were differences. There are and have been important differences, but as you know, you articulated, it was hard for people to grasp for them because of this wonderful phrase that we use in policy history all the time, the tyranny of small differences. And so both parties have been offering Americans tax cuts since, well, actually earlier than the 80s. We can start with the 80s. We can go earlier than that if you want. They've been offering people tax cuts, but the question is, whose taxes were being cut? And what was the point of that? And that's the big difference. And that's what the whole thing about the 90s with the Clinton tax cuts were. The Republicans wanted a tax cut for the wealthy and for the businesses. What Clinton got through after a massive government shutdown was a tax cut for the middle class. And I'm actually going to take issue with Deirdre's point about that incomes may be higher. Yes, incomes may be higher, but it doesn't change the fact that real wages for the working and middle classes have been stagnant for the 70s, and they started dip. No, the money does not, no, that is not false, and the money does not go as far as it used to be.
I understand we hear it all the time, that money wages are stagnant, people say, since, I don't know, the beginning of time. And it's just not true. Here's one point. One point is that the quality of goods has dramatically increased. This is a problem that I've spoken to the head of the consumer price index about this a couple of times, and she agrees that it's a very serious problem. Your smartphone is so much smarter than it was. I'm waiting for the time when it'll make my bed. It does so many things. Who needs a flashlight anymore? And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of that. So the price index that we can use to describe real wages, the purchasing power of ordinary wages, is wrong. And ask any economist this, and she'll say, yeah, it's a problem. And the other thing is that the wage figures don't include non-wage benefits. They don't include pensions. They don't include the promise of pensions. They don't include health care, which is very expensive in the United States for various reasons. They don't include paid vacations. They only talk about wages. And that's why you have these damn charts that you keep seeing on TV of the flat wages. It's a complete myth. The hollowing out of the middle class that you hear so much about, there is decisive evidence that that's because the people in the middle class or the lower middle class moved up to the upper middle class. It's, we've got to get beyond. And let me make one more economic point, an economist point. We talk about tax relief for business and corporations as though corporations were people. Now they're not. People are people. People own the corporations, they buy from the corporations, they work for the corporations. There's no, the old bumper sticker in my socialist days, tax corporations, not people, is crazy. It makes no sense. You tax corporations, you're not taxing someone up in Mars, you're taxing other human beings, Americans. So it's wrong. It's just economically wrong to talk about taxing as though reducing taxes on business didn't help ordinary people. It does.
Just to add as a footnote there that perhaps I shouldn't say it's going to bridge these two points of view, but it's something that people should certainly take seriously. Yes, non-monetary wages or compensation, non-wage compensation is significant. On the other hand, it's not clear that that's psychologically or economically the same thing as having more cash in your paycheck, especially when, if healthcare, if we're saying that, your compensation is actually pretty darn high because you're getting this health insurance from your employer, which is going to be really valuable. Well, one reason that's so valuable is because our healthcare costs are massively inflated. And we'd certainly have a disagreement here as to whether that's because government influence has already made healthcare extremely expensive, or because, if we had a single payer system, then healthcare would actually be cheaper. It's a mess. We've got the worst of both worlds, really, with our present healthcare system. So all of these things, in some cases, it's, different yardsticks are producing different results, and it's worth looking at the nature of the yardsticks for yourself to think through what kinds of how you want to interpret these data. It's very hard. I mean, this is one of the difficulties we face. I know Professor Shermer had mentioned earlier that, even an educated voter only has mastery, perhaps, of 2 or 3 issues. And that's an unavoidable fact of life in in an industrial or post-industrial economy as complex as our own. And there are always going to be different kinds of interpretations that people can put on huge aggregates of data. And it's getting worse and worse. And now, increasingly, just a pile of numbers is considered to be authoritative, even at the same time as we have a crisis in replication in terms of social science experiments. And it gets very hard to say, just how reliable data are, whether, surveys are conducted in good faith, whether, there's unintentional mutilation of the facts. And this is not a point against either side here. It's just, I think Americans should be, all people should be more skeptical in general about social science claims and should rely a bit more on common sense, which could potentially cut either way.
And that's where the humanities come in.
Yes.
Critical thinking, and it is no wonder, that is where, and the necessary for it is that it's the first thing on the chopping block when budget cuts come in, are the humanities.
Here's something amazing. A few years ago, the Minister of Education in Japan proposed for the state universities in Japan. Now, like the United States, Japan has lots of private universities, but let's talk about the state system in Japan, abolishing everything that was not a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And there are 2 things wrong with that. Large parts of these STEM fields are humanistic. Number theory, something that mathematicians are very interested in, is never going to have an application to anything. It's poetry in math, that's what it is. And then on the other hand, who's going to study Japanese literature? Who's going to talk about what it means to be Japanese if it's not the humanists in Japanese universities? So it's a completely loony idea, but as you said, it's becoming very popular. STEM fields, what a lot of nonsense.
I want to return in the sense, sort of in relation both to the humanities, to the decline of investment in human capital, and all these things. I know that sort of what I was suggesting in my text is a little, abstract or something, but it's a little, it can't be proven with any data, but I do think, or maybe it can, but I do think that there is a decline in the sort of the relationship between in politics as a sort of connective tissue between state and civil society, and this makes all kinds of decision making irresponsible. One thing that it's actually from Mexico that really made me think about this was this public housing thing that happened there in the last 20, 30 years, was that there was a move from these, this was a single party political system. There was high levels of corruption, but there was political pressures happening at every level of society. There was these sort of agrarian leagues, there was these labor unions, there was these all kinds of groupings, tenants associations, etc., and they all had weight in the party. What happened in the 1990s was that within the single party there was a sort of internal coup, and they were able to sort of cut down all these kinds of pressure. So returning to the housing thing, originally the sort of housing projects were happened in this very corrupt, clientelistic way. but they were set up, like the union was involved, and they were set up, but it was for certain groups of workers. They were set up near the near a factory or near a sort of the land that had been redistributed to these people. And now there's still these sort of public-private partnerships where they do build these houses and stuff, but they're in the middle of nowhere. There's no political pressure to sort of organize where this is going to go. It's just there's some cheap land somewhere. There's some kind of deal that is struck, some kind of financing possibility or something, and this is just how it's set up. And you know, the people are actually expected to sell off their homes eventually. There is no sense that politics has to respond to a sort of established civil society.
Yeah, but I don't want to take the view that politics is everything. And I don't want to have democratic socialism. Let's be clear on that. I don't want democracy in the workplace. That's crazy. To make collective decisions like going to war or something or helping the poor, then we need to vote. But we don't need to vote on our wages. That way lies the end of the economy. If you don't like your wages, leave. Go to another competitor. Under democratic socialism, where everything is majority vote, you don't get to leave.
Isn't freedom of assembly part of liberalism?
Freedom of assembly, but then
organizing in a union part of liberalism?
No, it's not. What's that again?
Democracy in the workplace is also union.
I know, and look, I don't know how many unions you've belonged to in your life. I've belonged to two: the National Maritime Union and the Faculty Union. So I'm not against unions, but I am against the idea that politics should be everything. I think that's a very dangerous attitude. Democracy should be a search for win-wins, real advantages for the poor and for everybody. It shouldn't be about bringing majority rule. You know, this is a classic problem, as you know, in political philosophy. It's what John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville and so on worried about. Majority rule is not the same thing as being good. That's Rousseau, the general will, and it has an expression in communism, and fascism, and various kinds of socialism and nationalism, and as I said, I say it's spinach, and I say to hell with it. What we need is free societies, in which people are free to move, free to change jobs if they don't like the job they're in.
Free to form a union.
Free to form, no, that won't do, because that's free to form a monopoly. If the union, look, I'm the only person here in this room who could become an apprentice electrician in the state of Michigan. I'm a little old for it, but maybe they'd make an exception, because my grandfather, my uncle, and a cousin were all members of the electricians union in Michigan. And the only way you get to be an apprentice in Michigan is to have a grandfather, an uncle, and a cousin in the union. That's not a good thing.
That's reductive of the American labor movement.
What?
That's very reductive of the American labor movement.
Reductive? Well, it depends on what kind of union you're talking about. If you're talking about industrial unions, they have essentially no effect. When I was in the faculty union, that was actually a subspecies of the Teamsters. Fine, I'm not. And the Teamsters union, it's been shown again and again, large industrial unions like that, with some exceptions like the auto workers, have no effect on wages, none at all. Because there are too many other ways of, but I don't think I'm sorry to have taken over this in this matter of, but a liberal society is a free society, and that's what we need.
Can I make a response just in defining liberal society? Just what I want to say: a liberal society is a society with a robust civil society, where people are free to associate and fight with each other.
Fight? What do you mean?
That is what civil society does.
Fight for control of the state, and then use the state to boss other people around.
That is what all kinds of groups of capitalists have done.
That's not what capitalists have done. This whole notion that the corporations are taking over politics, I think, is a myth.
They invest a lot of money in politics.
They invest a lot of money, and you and I can join in stopping them. But that doesn't mean that that's a good model. It's a bad model. We don't want politics. You don't want politics to be everything. We don't want force to be everything.
But force is all around us.
I know it is, but we've got to make it small instead of big. We've got to have choice.
Sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, let's get more of the audience.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. Not your fault. What's wrong with this thing? It keeps coming apart.
It's something that Marco said, and also you said about your family in the labor union. It kind of reminds me of Shanghai back in the 60s through 80s, where if you want to meet the mayor of Shanghai, you talk to your neighbor talks to their supervisor, the supervisor talks to somebody else. In the end, you get to meet the mayor of Shanghai. It seems to me it's a way of living in the communist system that's similar to what you said about Mexico, it's similar to what you said about the labor unions. It seems a sort of personalistic, almost a caudillo type of relationship system, a Guanxi system that can exist in any number of different types of state structures. And it seems to me that's what happened, for example, in Shanghai today. You can't meet the mayor of Shanghai anymore. The economy's become too complex. The the place is just too big. And so I think that's being destroyed in Shanghai, in Mexico, possibly with the labor unions, I don't know.
Well, you know the famous answer in Chicago when what's his name wanted to help out in the 1948 election. He came to the Democratic Party operative, said, "I want to help get Truman elected." And the guy said, "Who sent you?" And he said, "Nobody sent me. I just want to work for the party." We don't want nobody or nobody sent. That's the personalistic politics that we once had.
So I have a question that I think, if I followed the arc of the conversation well, I think it might lead to some good summary remarks. But as you give your closing remarks, if you want to say something else, feel free. But I guess it's a question premised on a divide that I think at least Marco and others have drawn between what we might call a neoliberal era beginning roughly in the 1970s into the present, and then some kind of new era that's coming into being. And we could call it Trumpian, or in some ways maybe Trump represents a prototype of what it will be, and we don't know the contours yet. But perhaps López Obrador in Mexico points in certain ways to what we might be seeing coming into being. And so my question is, how overall would you characterize the way in which democratic politics mediated the relationship between state and civil society in the era that seems to be passing out of existence? And then how in turn, in the era that is potentially coming into existence, do you think that might change? And finally, what, if anything, is liberal about the situation on either side of that divide? What, if anything, was liberal about the neoliberal era, and what, if anything, might be liberal about the era, symbolized or signaled by Brexit, Trump, López Obrador, that seems to be coming into being?
That's a lot. I think I'm going to focus on the question about the relationship between the state and the civil society, because for me, in that post-70s or that 70s era forward, you see a profound disconnect between the populists and their state. And I think that that's really sort of bred a lot of the problems that we have here in the United States, people feeling disaffected, disconnected, and not just from each other, but from the people that they elect and all these other things. And there's a lot of structural issues that sort of go in with that. And for me, it's interesting with this whole definition of neoliberal. It's funny. It's like, it's one of those words. It's like, one of the words that is thrown around that no one actually knows the definition to. The way that that I've always thought about it is that it's actually sort of dealing with this question we brought up earlier about what is it if you do not like the liberal state and you want to go back, the modern liberal state of the social welfare states constructed in the mid-20th century. What do you do around the world if you do not like them? Well, you have to take them apart. And so the thing is, the neoliberal state, such as it is, grows in certain ways to actually take apart the parts of the social welfare state that it doesn't actually sort of like, is the way that I think about it. But the question is, like, what might happen now as we look at popular insurgencies across the political spectrum or political map, however you want to graph. They have the three-dimensional graphs, all these things around the world, not just in this country. And I think that what we're seeing is that a lot of political scientists, the ones who used to do the research, was a very small field about democracies who decline, the democracies that fall apart. That we are to quote the great educator Clark Kerr, the architect of the master plan for higher education in California, in the University of California system, is that we sit on the hinge of history right now. We don't know. There is this incredible opportunity, this uprising, to actually have a stronger democratic policy, to have a stronger relationship between the state and civil society. I think that's very much on the agenda with the energy and enthusiasm, but I think it could also go the other way, not just in this country, but also around the world, is where I am seeing, there's so much on the table right now. It is truly extraordinary. We haven't seen something like this, I would argue, well, obviously since the 70s, but I also think since the 1930s.
The state and civil society are symbiotic, but as a symbiosis, it's the civil society which is, I think, the more foundational, and the state which, even though it's able to reinforce civil society in some respects, winds up often being simply parasitic upon civil society. And I think we've been trending in that direction for a very long time. It certainly, we looked very healthy during the Cold War. We looked very healthy, economically during the 1960s, during the Johnson era. And yet, I think there's a lot of grounds to think that we were already starting to tear things down a bit. Tear things down, not just, here I don't mean necessarily an economic argument, but basically psychological and cultural ideas of what it means to be a nation state, what it means to have solidarity and loyalties of various different kinds. And we can argue which kinds of solidarity and which kinds of loyalty are the healthiest and best, and the ones that lead us to the best conclusions. As has come up a few times in this discussion, Americans are fundamentally quite individualistic, and that isn't going to change. But there are good kinds and bad kinds of individualism. There are some kinds of individualism that are very compatible with social harmony, and there are other kinds of individualism which they're less compatible with harmony, I should say, than with servility. And I fear that that's the direction in which we've been moving quite recently over the last 25 years or so, with the rise of a sort of administrative politics that doesn't like the idea of real differences on the left and right. It likes the idea of a nice, safe Bush-Clinton center. And I'm delighted to see that that's breaking down and that we're actually getting some real choices in circulation now. And maybe the other choice we need here is perhaps not just the economically nationalist sort of Trump side of things, which I'm very sympathetic to, and the Bernie Sanders social democratic side, but also the libertarian side, that there really is a libertarian point of view that is quite different from and distinct from the neoliberalism, or whatever we might want to call the rather corrupt centrist politics that we've had for a generation. You're seeing some very interesting things right now in New Mexico. Rand Paul, who of course is an elected Republican politician, has just endorsed Gary Johnson, who's running as a libertarian candidate for the Senate there in New Mexico, and who's outpolling the Republican candidate. And just in the past day or so, the Democratic Secretary of State in New Mexico has reinstated party line voting, which is something that obviously will do very much harm to a libertarian candidate who, only has a party that has a couple of ballot lines as opposed to having a complete slate the way that Republicans and Democrats do. So there's interesting things afoot, but I'm actually very excited by the possibilities of this political moment. Even if there are things that I find alarming and that I think are too risky, I think that we've had a slow death of our sort of Republican institutions and our freedom over the past quarter century since the end of the Cold War, and that we really deferred. We thought we were deferring some tough choices at the end of the Cold War. In fact, we weren't deferring them; they were just being made by the Clintons and Bushes, and they led us into a disaster, especially in foreign policy.
Well, you have here the social democratic view and the conservative view, and I don't want to be called a libertarian anymore. I want you to stop saying that. I'm a liberal. If you want to call me a 19th century liberal or a classical liberal, that's okay. But the liberal idea is the most important political idea in the last 3 centuries, and it's the best. What we don't need is bigger government interfering with us, and and having the big struggle being over who can jail other people. We don't want such a powerful state, I don't think. I urge you to consider this possibility. The state can enforce these Civil Rights Acts. I think those are important, and can stop gerrymandering and so forth, but it should be much smaller than it is and not have to do with the economy. I don't believe in this vision that you get on both the right and the left in the conventional spectrum, that politics is the most important thing we do and is our identity. I don't believe that's true. I think we have other things we do in our life and our economy that should be, as much as possible, separated from politics.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm disappointed in the lack of interest in Mexico from all you gringos. No, I'm just joking. It's okay. I'm glad that I didn't focus on that, on the thing that I wrote. What I would say about state and civil society, and it's a big question. I think that that neoliberalism tried to get rid of politics for the to replace it with administration and kind of culture wars.
That's not my liberalism.
Right. No, I know, and I also I'm also a 19th century liberal in the sense that I believe that we should have a robust civil society with freedom of association, and which in our industrial society means that there will be large gatherings of workers that will want to associate with each other, especially because the interests of the capitalists will be to reduce their livelihood as much as possible. So politics is necessary to be able to acquire any power and acquire any sort of bargaining power in this society. That's how politics works. But the economy takes place in conditions that are always politicized. So since I believe that bourgeois society in the liberal sense is a revolutionary society, it's a society that can produce good for everyone. I believe that we need to mobilize the right kind of politics that will make it do that. And for that, the state might be necessary, but hopefully not permanent. Further about where we're going, I just think that this liberal establishment that try to like forget that politics existed is just having to finally deal with the fact that like people want things and will come back once and again in a sort of revolt to the third estate, trying to demand things over and over again, and there's just a lot of disillusion with this sort of depoliticized world that people really believed it in the 1990s, and I think it's really gone.
Okay.
So with that, I'll draw our event to a close. Before I do, I just want to say that conversations on the topics we've raised tonight are happening all the time here at NEIU in our history department, political science department, and other departments. So if you've been intrigued or engaged by something you heard tonight, please look into the course catalog. We're certainly very grateful for those departments' collaboration in this event series. So with that, please join me in giving our panelists a warm round of applause.